This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/broedeschanel. I've got a podcast called Rehash. I co-host it with my friend Hannah, and it's all about internet phenomena that get us all up in arms, only to forget about them within a week. So we rehash them, as they say. We're launching our 5th season next week, which is all about what happens when art meets the internet. Is the sun rising on a new creative era, or did it set before it even began? Go check it out. In her seminal series, Erotic 80s, podcaster Karina Longworth talks about how, back when she was a child, sex was a far more fundamental aspect of popular culture than it is today. Miraculously, the 80s and 90s, which were arguably much less sex-positive than recent decades, contained a world of taboo content just waiting to be found. As Longworth puts it,
there was a kind of movie being made in the 80s and 90s that isn't being made in Hollywood anymore. A type of movie that made sex feel too complicated or too dangerous for a child to understand.
She's talking about the erotic thriller, a film genre defined by Linda Williams in her book The Erotic Thriller in Contemporary Cinema as noirish stories of sexual intrigue incorporating some form of criminality or duplicity, often as the flimsy framework for on-screen softcore sex. Films which seemed to dominate Hollywood in the late 20th century, but until very recently had more or less died out. Aside from the occasional flaccid attempt to revive it, the erotic thriller seemed to be on do not resuscitate mode. But then came Challengers, Luca Guadagnino's most recent feature, which has whipped the entire world into a frenzy. This tennis romp, which stars Zendaya, Josh O'Connor, and Mike Feist in a steamy pas de trois, has become the sort of film-going event that we haven't seen for a couple decades now. Critics everywhere are hailing it as the film of the summer, with one going so far as to deem it one of the sexiest movies ever made. When asked what kind of film they were trying to make, its director, Guadagnino, and writer, Justin Kuritsky's, are on different pages. Guadagnino has told everyone that the movie is not so much about tennis, a sport he has little interest in, than it is about a love triangle between the three characters. Kuritsky's, on the other hand, has said that rather than a romance, he'd prefer Challengers be viewed as an erotic tennis thriller. And I'm inclined to agree. But Maia, you say, aren't erotic thrillers all about crime and violence? Someone usually has to die. Someone actually has to have sex. Challengers has none of those things. Yes, Challengers has none of those things. But I'm here to argue that a film does not have to contain violence or even sex to be an erotic thriller. Actually, if we consider why thrillers that were filled with violence dominated the 80s and 90s, Challengers is the perfect erotic thriller for our current cultural climate. Let me tell you why. Since any classic erotic thriller uses innuendo to bypass rating systems, I too will use innuendo in this video to bypass YouTube's community guidelines. Let's go. Okay, so, a crash course history. During the era of the motion picture production code, a bunch of films came out that commented on the anxieties of the time by pushing the boundaries of the code and leaning heavily into innuendo. These were called noirs. Then a couple decades later, we had the sexual revolution, the code was now lifted, certain landmark rulings made taboos like nudity more permissible, and we got the exploitation boom.
Deep throat.
Sex became very, very prevalent on the big screen, and with a new rating system, X-rated movies like Midnight Cowboy and Last Tango in Paris that would previously have been ghettoized to the art house were becoming massive hits. This promised a future where, finally, sex could exist on our screens for sex sake, or in the words of Raine Taberski, films that could provide mass and authentic erotic experiences. Only that didn't happen. Instead, sex had become so prevalent on the big screen that it was now no longer exciting. In a way, it was just another day at the movies. So if it wanted to be on our screens outside of just outright prawn, it had to have a philosophical reason for being there. Taberski hypothesizes that if film critics wanted to say they had seen a sex film, there had to be something behind the sex they could talk about, or else they were just admitting on a public platform to being thorny. So they became less open to erotic films in their reviews. Renowned critic Andrew Sarris wrote at one point, "It is a mistake to over-dramatize the situation. The saga of the screen's liberation is singularly lacking in heartwarming heroics." And it seems others felt this shift as well, because the Supreme Court issued a series of decisions in 1973, which made it possible for local governments to prosecute material that was deemed obscene, a category that would come to include more and more feature films. So, filmmakers had to get a bit more clever about how they would put sex in their films. As Longworth puts it,
they could find safer ways to riff on the idea of sexual danger, while still, most of the time, reaffirming the patriarchal status quo, and use the idea that they were flouting sexual mores to make a lot of money.
This is where we got the erotic thriller, an updated take on the noir, but without as many of the Code era restrictions. And unlike your standard erotic film, the erotic thriller uses sex as a vehicle for some greater message. So typically with a film like this, you get crime and danger, you get an overlapping of the concepts of sex and death, and you often also get a noir-style femme fatale, or in Williams' words, a female protagonist who herself straddles the roles of sexual interest, enraged victim, and vigilante survivor. But why did the erotic thriller have to be so centered on crime and violence at this time? Well, we'll get there. A whole host of erotic thrillers have been made in the late 70s and 80s, like 10, Body Heat, The Postman Always Rings Twice, Crimes of Passion, and Jagged Edge, but none would become the absolute phenomenon that was 1987's Fatal Attraction. And if we're going off what Williams said about a female character straddling the roles of sexual interest, enraged victim, and vigilante survivor, in Fatal Attraction, we'll see her become more or less just an enraged victim. Fatal Attraction, directed by Adrian Lyne and starring Glenn Close and Michael Douglas, is widely considered the film to really kick off the erotic thriller genre. It tells the story of a decidedly average man named Dan, who engages in a brief affair with a successful woman named Alex Forrest after meeting her at a work party. Dan is bored of domestic bliss with his beautiful wife Beth, played by Anne Archer, and is regrettably seduced by Alex to play out his fantasy of the good old days as a single man. Unfortunately, Alex imprints on him and grows attached after their tryst. The horror. The rest of the film shows Alex becoming increasingly erratic, stalking Dan, and posing serious threats to his family, which leads to her boiling their daughter's bunny. If it couldn't get any worse, the film culminates in Alex breaking into their apartment to murder Beth, only for Beth to murder Alex instead. Longworth's episode on Fatal Attraction focuses mostly on how the film was rewritten at the 11th hour to feed a very unhealthy public appetite. Essentially, Fatal Attraction was conceived as a feature-length version of a short film called Diversion, made by James Dearden, who would come on as the screenwriter for Fatal Attraction. Diversion is about a woman who attempts suicide after having an affair with a married man, a woman who has been hurt and brushed aside one too many times, who struggles with mental illness, and who, above all, refuses to be ignored, in Longworth's words. Diversion also promotes solidarity between the two women and casts a critical eye on the man. It actually starts with him going into his little black book while his wife is away, and thus conducting the affair. And most importantly, it does not end with the other woman being murdered. When she saw Diversion, Paramount producer Sherry Lansing, who wanted to see her experience of getting abruptly dumped reflected on screen in a sympathetic way, heavily backed its development as a feature-length film. But when Fatal Attraction was initially rejected for being too unsympathetic to its male protagonist, major changes were made. To his credit, Adrian Lyne, who is typically an op of this channel, was sympathetic towards the Alex character, and his film was much closer to Diversion in its original edits. But when they showed Fatal Attraction in test runs, they noticed a considerable bloodthirstiness among audiences, who wanted to see Alex not only dead at the end of the film, but killed at the hands of Beth. And this is how we got the official ending, which was so popular among audiences at the time that the prevalence of men standing up and whooping as Alex dies became a global phenomenon. Fatal Attraction ended up being the second highest grossing film that year and spent a whopping 8 weeks in the #1 domestic box office spot. Lyne himself really liked the original ending, where Alex commits suicide and Dan is arrested for murder before being absolved, but he conceded that audiences around the world would have thrown rocks at the screen. Fatal Attraction does have sex scenes, one being where Dan and Alex hump enthusiastically against the sink while the water is running, and another where the two hook up in a dark elevator, Flashdance style. But I would say that they're not so much erotic as they are kind of violent. And this is by design. we have to consider why such an untitillating, absurd movie would be more successful than any other erotic thriller, matched only by Basic Instinct 5 years later. What was going on in the late 80s? Well, the early 80s saw an unfortunate financial recession. Add to that a counter-revolution to the women's movement of the decades prior, explored in Susan Faludi's groundbreaking book, Backlash, where men were acting out against the perceived threat of women in the workforce. Then take the trad, family-centric Reaganism of the time, and pair that with a now peaking AIDS crisis, which, although being deliberately ignored by the Reagan administration, flooded popular culture with a newfound terror around sex. In millions of cases, sex was danger. Sex was death. In his review of the film, Jay Hoberman wrote in The Village Voice that Fatal Attraction was a metaphor for just how devastating sex itself can be. It's stunned by the power of love, to make people disrupt their lives, lose control, suffer delirium, forget who they are, leap into the abyss. The film is compelling because ultimately there is no such thing as safe sex. Maybe this was true, but many critics also found that Fatal Attraction, which characterizes a high-powered, single, childless career woman as a psychopathic, castrating monster, had simply exploited real anxieties of the time surrounding sex to push what was ultimately an anti-feminist message. Fatal Attraction co-opted the aesthetics of the sexual revolution films to draw people in, but made the erotics goofy and the violence deeply erotic, all to reinforce a very conservative, very damaging status quo. In many such erotic thrillers, sex is never really sex. Instead, permissiveness was to be punished by death. Yet even still, they got audiences hot and bothered. I call the 80s and 90s the era of the sex event, a time where movies which featured sex scenes are now remembered for the wider cultural activity around those sex scenes. Fatal Attraction is known for the physical reaction it provoked in men.
Didn't you see Fatal Attraction?
You wouldn't let me!
It scared the shit out of me. It scared the shit out of every man in America!
Sharon Stone's white dress interrogation in Basic Instinct is remembered as the most paused moment in film history. Wild Things, arguably less critically successful than the first two films, is often talked about as the film millennials, then children, would sneak in to see. There's an entire scene about it in Pen 15, where a bunch of the tween characters gathered together at this kid's house because his cousin had gotten a VHS copy of it. Everyone wanted to see Denise Richards, Neve Campbell, and Matt Dillon get it on. The sexual content in this era was an event of mass hysteria, and this is what we're seeing today with Challengers. When Challengers first made its way to the public, many people compared it to another film about a steamy love triangle, that being Y Tu Mama Tambien. This beloved movie, which came out in 2001 and was directed by Alfonso Cuarón, is about two boys named Julio and Tenoch who seek out a summer of thrills after their girlfriends leave on a trip to Europe. They meet a slightly older woman named Luisa, and in the hopes that she'll hook up with one or both of them, invite her out on a road trip across Mexico. For reasons which we'll get into, Luisa agrees to join them, and they set out on an adventure. And what's remembered most about Y Tu Mama Tambien is the various intimate encounters that Luisa and the boys respectively share on their journey, climaxing in a very erotic moment between all three of them once they reach their final destination. Obviously, the two movies have a lot in common. Two gawky boys approach a self-assured woman. She enjoys an intimate relationship with each of them, which causes friction within the group and a competitive spirit between the boys. Also in both movies, there is sexual tension between the boys themselves, which is either heavily alluded to or just stated outright. Like Karitsky says, what's true about a love triangle is that every love triangle is, by its nature, queer. Whether you intend to be or not, you're in an intimate relationship with two other people. It reminds me of a book I'm reading called Freedom by Jonathan Franzen, in which there's a love triangle between the three main characters, a husband Walter, a wife Patty, and Walter's best friend Richard. And in it, Richard talks about a deeply suppressed desire for Walter that has driven him to sleep with Patty, a desire that's mixed up with resentment and envy for who Walter is and for the life he leads. This is something explored in both movies. Each person in the triangle desires something that the other person has. For Tashi, it's the boy's ability to play tennis. For Art, it's Pat's confidence, the respect he commands from Tashi, and the ease of his tennis skills. For Pat, it's Art's commitment, both to Tashi and even begrudgingly his sport, which has made him more successful than Pat is. In Y Tu Mama Tambien, Luisa uses her sexuality to bring the boys back together again when their friendship is torn apart after each confesses to sleeping with the other's girlfriend. On the flip side, just before she agrees to go on the trip, she finds out that not only has her husband been cheating on her, but that she has terminal cancer. So the boys have given her an escape. They need her to bring them together, and she needs them to free her, to feel the reckless abandon of their youth. But the thing is, Y Tu Mama Tambien is not an erotic thriller. Why? Why? Well, that answer can be found in its style. Y Tu Mama Tambien is an absolutely breathtaking film. Its soft, lush visuals cast a very sad and sentimental tone over it. The camera is wandering and wistful, gently dancing across the action and then meandering away as if distracted. For all the comedy it has, this movie has a very tragic undercurrent running through it. It's like a melancholic postcard. Challengers, on the other hand, couldn't be more different. Its editing is absurdly quick, even in the most tender moments. It's got a really noisy score that almost never rests. There's barely a moment of downtime. And most of all, it's expressionistic. A major reason Cuarón wanted to make Y Tu Mama Tambien is because he wanted to showcase Mexico's political and cultural climate of that period. Through his very pared-back, documentary-esque style, we get a sense of the country as a backdrop for this very humanizing story. Challengers, on the other hand, has markedly little interest in a political or cultural backdrop. It's inexplicably set in 2019, which was the subject of a lot of jokes on Twitter when it came out, and although Karitzkis said he had based much of Tashi's character on legendary tennis player Serena Williams, the movie never touches on the many race-related obstacles that Williams has faced throughout her career as a black woman. Really, all of the film's messaging is in its style, which is typical of an erotic thriller. Challenger's themes are simple and broken down for us. We have the overt phallic imagery of churros and bananas, being bitten off castration style to evoke tension and envy between the boys, much like a gun-wielding woman in a classic thriller. We have the image of Tashi wearing shoes tall enough to tower over Art during their first intimate encounter, evoking her dominance over him. We have loud, very obvious musical cues whenever things are heating up between the characters, which is especially ominous in this scene on the beach where the two talk to Tashi about a moment of extreme intimacy she experienced with an opponent during one of her matches.
You screamed when you hit the winner. Never heard anything like it before.
We even have a femme fatale, which is diffused into two characters. The obvious one being Tashi, who, unlike Luisa, is actively thwarting the men and emasculating them whenever she can. The trailer's even got a shot of the camera zooming over her devious face as Nelly Furtado's man-eater plays over top. And then the other femme fatale being Pat, who prowls around with an air of unpredictability, always threatening the equilibrium of a given moment. But nothing is as thrillerish than the camera work. Guadagnino said that for him, the camera had to witness the entanglement of the three leads with extreme intimacy. Although, I'd argue his camera isn't really intimate at all. It's constantly swerving and swooping and panning as fast as possible over the action. At one point, the camera even becomes a tennis ball, bouncing us back and forth between Art and Patrick as they play. As opposed to the intimate cinematography of Y Tu Mama Tambien, or even Guadagnino's other film, Call Me By Your Name, Challengers evokes more of a cool, detached, David Fincher style of cinematography, which makes it feel more like a thriller. And guess who else works with Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross? The expressionistic elements of the film, like the chiaroscuro, high-contrast lighting in a classic noir, like the white, sterile clothing in Fatal Attraction, come together to create a visceral, emotional experience for the viewer. The approach is, how do you convey lust through a screen? The style of Challengers bats us between the ever-changing interplay of power and control of the three main characters, and thus builds tensions throughout so that by the final match, we're on the edge of our seats, not unlike audiences shouting at the screen in 1987. Don't worry, I can still hear you saying, but Maia, Challengers doesn't have any crime in it. Well, guess what? I don't think a movie needs to be about crime and violence in order to be an erotic thriller. I think that worked perfectly well in the 80s and 90s, where people were responding to the renewed sexual freedoms in Hollywood, whilst also having to satisfy an increasingly conservative and frightened viewing public. But what makes an erotic thriller for me above all else is the idea of sublimation. How can we offload our sexual anxieties into other things? In the case of the 80s and 90s thriller, it was crime. Sex had a very real element of danger to it, and so movies needed to show that. In the case of Challengers, it's tennis. You see, in Y Tu Mama Tambien, for example, sex is right there in the open. The characters clearly want to have it for its sake, and thus it becomes an explicit vehicle for greater themes, like the way it both brings these people together and then at the end tears them apart, as the boys no longer stay friends in the awkwardness that ensues after the three-way, and in their grief over Luisa, who succumbs to her illness a month after the events of the film. But in Challengers, there is no sex. Every intimate encounter is stymied before it can ever be consummated. So instead, as everyone's been saying, the sex is tennis. At multiple points, which the film directly comments on, the characters get confused between the sport and their relationships.
Were we talking about tennis?
We're always talking about tennis.
I haven't beaten most of the guys who played these things. This is a game about winning the points that matter.
We're not talking about tennis.
What the f else do I have to talk to you about?
Art can't see us together. He already thinks I planned this to humiliate him.
Didn't you?
Not this part.
You can never tell whether the boys are attracted to Tashi because of who she is or because of her skills.
Look at that f***ing backhand.
And they use a serving technique to slyly let each other know whether the other has slept with her. Tashi's dynamic with the boys is replicated on the court. She bullies and dominates Art while they play, as she does in her marriage, whereas Pat doesn't allow her in enough to even talk about tennis with him. Tashi becoming their coach is a shorthand for becoming their girlfriend. She is constantly conflating the sport with who she will choose. She dates Patrick on the basis that he beats Art in a game, and she will leave Art if he loses the final match. Why tennis? Well, it's kind of the perfect tension builder. Two people are having this heated back and forth. Emotions run high, there's lots of grunting, which is almost comically exaggerated in the film. Like, we get it, Art's a bottom. And most of all, unlike hockey or soccer or basketball, there's a physical distance between players, and a physical obstacle between them, the net. As Kuritsky's puts it, tennis is all about not touching. Tennis is about just missing the other person so that they can't get to the ball. So to me, I feel like within tennis there's a lot of repression because it's so tightly controlled. There's so many rules around where the ball has to fall, the way you have to serve, and where your foot lands and all of that. But at the same time, once the ball is in play, there's this really wild abandon that takes over. As many people have noted, the tennis scenes are the sex scenes. It's where all of the energy is released, and it visualizes power and control. It's a literalization of desire, lust, envy, in the same way crime and murder once were. Another obvious change that the movie makes to the genre is that no one in Challengers is punished for having sex. And the most important distinction here lies between Tashi and a femme fatale like Alex. We've had some pretty serious reckonings over the past decade that have completely shifted the way sex is approached in popular media. As successful as Fatal Attraction was, there's just no room in our society for another Alex Forrest, which would make it very hard for the traditional erotic thriller to thrive as it once did. So in Challengers, Tashi is a femme fatale in the sense that she dominates the men around her, deceives them for her own gain, and threatens their masculinity. But unlike Alex or other traditional femme fatales, she isn't a metaphor for the dangers of lust. Sex with Tashi is actually largely beneficial to both Art and Patrick, as tormented as they may be. While it may seem that his desire for her has kept Patrick from pursuing a more lucrative career, or Art from quitting something from which he no longer finds joy, what the final match proves is that what these three people need most of all is a really freaking great game of tennis. What makes that game great is different for each person, but in the end, all three, even with Tashi in the stands, have found a synchronicity. That moment of intimacy Tashi was speaking of on the beach. No one is punished for having sex. They're rewarded for it. But to be honest, when I watched that final match, I was kind of irritated. The scene is like a never-ending string of build-ups and beat drops. It's non-stop slow-mo, close-ups on hands and sweat droplets, pounding electronic music, the shots stopping or slowing down and speeding up again as Art and Patrick are serving back and forth. This happens for a full 11 minutes, and for me, seemed to cut the legs off of any real climax. That is until Art jumps up to get the ball, flies over the net, lands in Patrick's arms, Tasha yells out, then before anything else can happen, we cut to black. In a particularly negative review of the film for The New Yorker, Tyler Foggatt comments on the abruptness of this ending and observes, "We barely have time to register who, if anyone, won before the screen cuts to black. By depriving viewers of a climax for as long as possible, it seems that you can almost circumvent the awkwardness that comes from post-coital clarity." Which I think poses a really good question. What exactly is this post-coital clarity that the movie seems to be postponing for us?
Can you put your dick away?
Challengers may not be about crime, it may not be violent, it may not even be punishing, but it's still commenting on the sexual anxieties of our present-day culture. Like, why can't the movie be as in-your-face thorny as its marketing makes it out to be? Why does the desire have to be sublimated? Foggatt goes on in her discussion of the ending to explain that the moment of release, which is when Tasha yells, isn't necessarily what made audiences go crazy over this film. Instead, what's telling, she says, is how positively audiences responded to 2+ hours of being edged. Challengers is a film made for a culture that is obsessed with build-up. And it's important to think about why this might be. Well, according to certain experts, we're currently living in the midst of a sex recession. In the past decade, we've undergone some major societal changes, like I said. Me Too, the pandemic, the rise of dating apps, the democratization of prawn, surging rates of anxiety and depression, the ubiquity of smartphones, Sam Levinson, that have resulted in a culture that's not only more skeptical of sex, but apathetic to it. It's not like it isn't available to us. Hell, it's more available than ever. Yet, we're having less of it by the day. So in a time where we're seeing sex everywhere, but not actually engaging in the physical act, whether that be because we're living with our parents longer, engaging in online relationships, feeling anxious about it, or just plain uninterested in it, what we're experiencing is a strong feeling of yearning. Because, not to get all we live in a society on you, but these days it feels like we can never be satiated. We're beholden to these devices that, by design, keep us always wanting more, always expecting something better to come around. We live to yearn. And the biggest cornerstone of yearning is desire. We can't or won't have sex, so instead, we create a fantasy of it. It becomes something that's always just out of reach, just after the screen cuts to black. And at a moment where sex is everywhere, yet there is none to be had, what better film to satiate all this pent-up desire than the erotic thriller? Think back to its heyday, which came right after a cultural fatigue with the ubiquity of sex on screen, when sex was on unstable ground. It couldn't just exist as sex for sex's sake. It had to be covert. It had to have deeper meaning. It had to be metaphorical. Challengers scratches an itch in our brains that doesn't really want resolution. Doesn't even want to see sex, because it has metaphor. As Michael Nicholas writes in his review of the film, complex ideas almost always elude easy explanation, so we reach for metaphors, either consciously or not. What makes the tennis metaphor so perfect for a present-day erotic thriller is that it keeps us in anticipation. It distills and simplifies for us all our complicated feelings and serves them back and forth between two angry, thorny people, building and building for what feels like forever until we finally get that fleeting, very unimportant moment of release. This video is sponsored by Mubi, a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from all around the globe. It's for lovers of great cinema and those who don't know they love great cinema yet. Because the beauty of Mubi is that it exposes you to artful, thought-provoking, and innovative films you would never think to watch. A movie that recently premiered on Mubi is Gasoline Rainbow by the Ross Brothers. It's about a group of American teens who embark on a cross-country road trip after high school graduation, and all the characters they meet along the way. Gasoline Rainbow is incredibly atmospheric and dreamy, and it's a very truthful portrait of adolescent restlessness and the country that begets it. I had the pleasure of moderating a Q&A with Bill and Turner Ross, and we talked about their inspirations for the film, their process as filmmakers, and the movie's most unlikely comparison, Crossroads. You can watch the Q&A on Mubi's YouTube channel, and you can find Gasoline Rainbow streaming now on Mubi. Plus, if you're a student, you can check out Mubi's exclusive offer just for students, anywhere in the world. To become a student member on Mubi, all you need is your school email address and to be currently enrolled in university or higher education. As a student member, you have special access to an exclusive discounted plan, a student-only curated film collection, events, contests, and prizes. You can try Mubi free for 30 days at mubi.com/broedeschanel. That's mubi.com/broedeschanel for a whole month of great cinema for free. For information about student memberships, visit the link in my description. Special thank you to Syed Hassan, Mel Pertwee, Morgan, Cooper Stimson, Nadia C., Nick, Jenny Eller, J. Frost McFinnigan, Gabriel M., The Wiz Daniel, Edward Yu, Andrew Nguyen, Connor O'Keefe, Sharma, Daniel Sardunas, Jenya, Ryan Blythe, Maya Kameva, Naomi Nakagawa, Scott Barnett, Julia Campana, Alexis, Nafis Bullock, Carrie Gavin, RSS, Fridtjof Holstrom, Alex Short, and Kelly Wolf for supporting this channel.